I always thought my life with Emily was a masterpiece. A canvas painted with trust and quiet moments that felt like they'd stretch into forever. We'd been married 12 years, built a home in a sleepy suburb outside Portland, where the rain tapped our windows like a metronome to our routines. She was a paralegal, sharp and meticulous. Her auburn hair always tied back in a way that made her look both severe and soft. I was a structural engineer, spending my days sketching blueprints for bridges that'd outlast me. Our daughter, Lily, was 9, our little tether to something bigger than ourselves. Life wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, predictable, like the girders I calculated to hold weight without bending. But cracks don't announce themselves. They spider out silently, and you only see them when the whole thing buckles. It started with a hunch, a flicker in my gut I couldn't pin down. Emily's late nights at the office had stretched longer. Case files, she said, piling up like autumn leaves. I'd nod, kiss her forehead when she slipped into bed smelling of coffee and ink. I didn't question it. Why would I? She'd always been the one who kept our world level. But then there were the glances she'd throw at her phone, the way her fingers hesitated before tapping out replies. Small things, tiny tremors. One Thursday, Lily was at a sleepover, and I decided to surprise Emily with dinner. I drove to her firm, a sleek building with glass walls that reflected the drizzle like a mirror. Her car was there, parked crookedly, but the office was dark. I waited, engine idling, rain streaking the windshield. An hour passed, then 2. At 9:47 p.m., she emerged, not from the office, but from a black SUV 2 spaces over. A man stepped out with her, tall, broad-shouldered, his hand brushing her elbow as they laughed. My chest tightened. I didn't honk. I didn't call. I just watched, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, as she slid into her car and drove off. I followed her home that night, tail lights blurring in the wet, my mind a tangle of questions I wasn't ready to ask. Back at the house, she smiled like nothing had shifted, kissed me goodnight, and said she was exhausted. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, the rain's rhythm now a hammer against my skull. Who was he? Why the lie? I didn't sleep. Instead, I started digging quietly, methodically, like I was drafting a bridge to span the gap between what I knew and what I feared. The next morning, I played my part. Pancakes for Lily, coffee for Emily, a kiss on her cheek as she rushed out the door. Big case, she said, her voice light, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I smiled back, but my hands were already itching to move. I called in sick, first time in years, and sat at my desk, laptop open, her phone bill pulled up from our shared account. Numbers don't lie like people do. There it was, a string of calls and texts to a number I didn't recognize late at night, sometimes for hours. My stomach churned, but I kept going, cross-referencing it online. It belonged to a Matthew Grayson, a name that meant nothing to me yet. I searched him. LinkedIn popped up first. Matthew Grayson, 38, real estate developer, based in Portland. His photo showed a square jaw, dark hair, a grin that looked like it cost money. I scrolled Emily's firm's website next. There he was, listed as a client on a property dispute from 6 months back. So that's how they met. My mind stitched it together. Late nights, case files, his hand on her arm. I felt sick, but I needed more. I drove to her office again that afternoon, parked across the street, and waited. At 4:12 p.m., the black SUV rolled in. Matthew. He didn't go inside, just sat there, texting. 5 minutes later, Emily walked out, her coat pulled tight, and slid into his passenger seat. They drove off, and I tailed them, keeping my distance. They stopped at a cafe downtown, a pretentious little place with Edison bulbs and overpriced lattes. Through the window, I watched them. She laughed, her head tilting the way it used to with me. He leaned in, his hand resting on hers across the table. My throat burned. I snapped photos with my phone, blurry but clear enough. Back home, I uploaded them to my laptop, staring at the evidence like it was a blueprint I could unbuild. Lily came home that night, chattering about her sleepover, and I hugged her too hard, anchoring myself to something real. Emily got back at 10 p.m., claiming a deposition ran late. I nodded, poured her wine, asked about her day. She rambled, her words too polished, and I listened, plotting. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed to know how deep this went, how long I'd been blind. That night, I slipped into her office bag while she showered, found a burner phone tucked in a side pocket. The lock code was Lily's birthday. Inside, messages to M. Intimate, playful, plans to meet again. My hands shook as I read them, the water running in the background like static over my rage. I didn't sleep again. The burner phone was back in her bag by morning, but its contents were seared into me. The messages weren't just flirtations. They were a map of something bigger, something I couldn't unsee. Can't wait for Saturday, she'd written. The cabin's all ours. His reply, just you, me, and the lake. No interruptions. A cabin. A weekend. My mind spun. Saturday was 2 days away, and she'd already told me she had a work retreat. I believed her, even offered to pack her bag. I dug deeper. Her laptop was password protected, but I knew her habits, same code as the phone. While she took Lily to school, I cracked it open. Emails, calendar invites, a rental confirmation for a lakefront cabin an hour north. Not a retreat. A getaway. With him. Then I found the photos, buried in a folder labeled Miscellaneous, Emily and Matthew, arms around each other, smiling against a backdrop of trees and water. Some were recent. Others dated back months. Months. This wasn't new. It was a life I'd been excluded from. But the real twist, the thing that made my blood freeze, was a subfolder, art. Inside were sketches, dozens of them, hand-drawn by Emily. Her talent for drafting, something I'd always admired, turned against me. They depicted her and Matthew in moments I couldn't stomach, intimate, tender, but with a strange twist. In each, she'd drawn herself as a bird, wings spread, and him as a tree, rooted and strong. One sketch showed the bird perched on the tree, another had it flying away, a third had the tree's branches curling around it possessively. It was their story, their private mythology, etched in her hand. She'd never drawn me like that. Never us. I printed them, every single one, my hands trembling as the printer whirred. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a reinvention, a world she'd built without me. I stared at the sketches, the bird and the tree mocking me from the page. My wife, my Emily, had flown somewhere I couldn't follow. And Saturday, that was their next chapter. I wouldn't confront her yet. No, I'd let her go to that cabin. I'd follow. I'd see it all. And then I'd decide how to snap those wings. Friday morning, I was a ghost in my own home. Emily packed her bag, humming, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. Work retreat, she said again, tossing in a sweater and her favorite boots. I offered to help, my voice steady, my hands folding her clothes with care. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and I felt the lie in her lips. Lily hugged her goodbye, and I watched them, my daughter's trust ablaze in my chest. Emily left at noon, promising to call when she arrived at the retreat. I waved from the porch, then went inside and started planning. I called my sister, Claire, asked her to take Lily for the weekend. Everything okay? She asked, her tone probing. Just need some time, I said, dodging. She agreed, and I dropped Lily off that afternoon, her backpack bouncing as she ran to Claire's door. Back home, I packed my own bag, binoculars, camera, a hunting knife I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't sure why I grabbed it. Maybe it was instinct, a weight to steady my hands. I found the cabin's address in Emily's email, mapped it. A secluded spot on Lake Tillamook, surrounded by pines. Perfect for them. Perfect for me. I drove up that night, headlights off on the final stretch, parking a quarter-mile from the cabin down a dirt track. The place was lit up, warm light spilling from the windows onto the gravel. Matthew's SUV was there, Emily's car beside it. I crept closer, the damp earth muffling my steps, and settled behind a thicket of ferns. Through the window I saw them, Emily pouring wine, Matthew stoking a fire. They moved like they'd done this before, a rhythm I didn't recognize in her. She laughed, her head thrown back, and he pulled her close, their shadows merging on the wall. My jaw clenched so hard I tasted blood. I stayed there, crouched in the dark, for hours. They ate, talked, disappeared upstairs. The lights dimmed. I didn't move. My mind wasn't on them anymore. It was on the sketches, the bird and the tree, the life she'd drawn without me. Revenge wasn't a word I'd used yet, but it was forming, sharp and cold. I drove back at dawn, the knife still in my bag, my hand steady now. I'd seen enough. The cabin was theirs for 2 nights. I had one more day to decide how to uproot that tree and clip her wings for good. Saturday morning, I sat at my desk, the sketches spread out like a battlefield. The bird and the tree stared back, taunting me with their intimacy, their permanence. Emily had called last night, her voice chipper over the phone, spinning tales of a retreat that didn't exist. I'd played along, asked about her colleagues, said I missed her. She'd laughed, promised to be home Sunday night. I hung up and stared at the ceiling, the rain outside a drumbeat to my thoughts. This wasn't just about her leaving me. It was about her rewriting me out of her story, turning me into a footnote. I spent the day building something. Not a bridge, not this time. A reckoning. I drove to a hardware store, bought supplies. Heavy-duty cable ties, a portable welder, steel rods, a lockbox. My engineering mind clicked into gear, precise and unemotional. I worked in the garage, welding the rods into a frame, small but sturdy, a cage just big enough for a bird. I painted it black, let it dry, and hid it in my trunk. The cable ties and lockbox went in a duffel bag with the knife. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet. Trap her, scare her, make her feel what I felt, but it was a start. That night, I returned to the cabin. They were outside now, by the lake, a blanket spread under the stars. Emily's hair caught the moonlight, and Matthew's arm draped over her like he owned her. I watched through the binoculars, my breath shallow, the cage rattling in my trunk behind me. They went inside eventually, and I waited, the forest alive around me. At 2 a.m., I moved. Not to confront, not yet, but to plant the first seed. I slipped to Matthew's SUV, sliced a thin cut in his brake line, just enough to leak slow. Not fatal, not yet, but a warning. A tremor in their perfect world. Back home, I showered, scrubbed the dirt and rage off me, and waited for Sunday. She'd come back, smiling, lying, and I'd be ready. The cage was just the beginning. My revenge would be slow, deliberate, a structure she couldn't escape. She'd drawn herself a bird, free and wild. I'd make her feel caged, grounded, until she understood what she'd broken. Sunday afternoon crept in slow and gray, the rain a steady pulse against the windows. I'd spent the morning polishing my act, shaving, brewing coffee, setting out Emily's favorite mug like nothing had shifted. The cage sat in the garage, hidden under a tarp, its black frame a secret humming in my bones. When her car pulled into the driveway at 6:03 p.m., I was ready. She stepped inside, her cheeks flushed, her bag slung over her shoulder, and smiled like she hadn't spent 2 nights carving me out of her life. "Missed you," she said, dropping a kiss on my lips. I tasted the lie, but I smiled back, my teeth gritted behind it. She chattered about the retreat, team-building exercises, a stuffy conference room, bad coffee. I nodded, poured her wine, asked questions I already knew the answers to. "How was the drive?" I said, casual, watching her sip. "Fine," she replied, too quick, her eyes flicking to her phone. I wondered if Matthew had noticed his breaks yet, if he'd felt the first shiver of my handiwork. I didn't ask about him. Not yet. Instead, I played the husband she expected, warm, steady, blind. Lily came home from Claire's an hour later, bounding into Emily's arms, and I watched them, my daughter's joy a splinter in my chest. That night, she showered, and I checked her bag again. The burner phone was there, buzzing with a new message. "Miss you already. Brakes acting weird. Gonna get it checked." My lips twitched. Good. Let him squirm. I deleted the message, slid the phone back, and climbed into bed beside her. She curled against me, her warmth a mockery, and I lay awake, plotting. The cage wasn't enough, not yet. I needed something bigger, something that'd mirror the sketches, the bird and the tree she'd made her gospel. I'd uproot him. I'd ground her. And I'd do it so slow she'd feel every inch of the fall. Monday morning, she left for work, and I called in sick again. My boss grumbled, but I didn't care. I had a bridge to dismantle. Not steel this time, but flesh and lies. I drove to Matthew's office, a glassy high-rise downtown, and watched from my car. He arrived at 9:17, his SUV limping slightly, his jaw tight. I smiled. Step 1. Now for her. I spent the day researching Matthew Grayson, his deals, his properties, his life. Public records showed a condo in the Pearl District, a lake house he'd flipped last year, a marriage that had crumbled 2 years back. No kids, no ties. A man who built things like me but tore them down for profit. I found his ex-wife's blog, buried online. A bitter rant about his charm, his wandering hands, patterns. Emily wasn't the first. That stung worse. Somehow, knowing she'd fallen into a script he'd rehearsed. I tailed him that afternoon, watched him leave his mechanic with a rental car. A sleek sedan, no match for the SUV's swagger. The brake line had done its job. Inconvenience, not destruction. Not yet. I followed him to Emily's firm, saw her slip into his car again. Their heads bent close. My camera clicked. More photos stacking up like evidence for a trial I'd never hold. They drove to a bar this time, tucked in an alley, and I waited outside, the rain soaking my jacket. An hour later, they emerged. Her arm looped through his, and I snapped one last shot. Her laughing, him whispering, the streetlight haloing them like some twisted romance. Back home, I printed the photos, added them to my collection, the sketches, the emails, the lies. But I needed more than proof. I needed her to feel it, to see the cage closing. That night, I left a sketch on her pillow. One of hers, the bird flying free, but I'd added my own touch. Faint pencil lines of bars around it, a cage in shadow. She found it after dinner, frowned, asked, "Where'd this come from?" I shrugged, said I'd found it in the office, thought it was pretty. Her face paled, just for a second, and I knew she'd caught the hint. Doubt. The first crack in her wings. She didn't sleep well that night. I heard her tossing, her breath uneven. Good. Let it fester. I stayed up, sketching my own design. Not a bird, not a tree, but a trap. A way to bind them both, to make them face what they'd built. The cage in the garage was physical, but this was mental, a lattice of fear and consequence I'd weave around her. Tuesday, I upped the game. Emily left for work, her eyes shadowed, the sketch still unspoken between us. I drove to Matthew's condo, parked a block away, and waited. He left at 8:45, briefcase in hand, his stride clipped. I slipped on gloves, grabbed a package from my trunk. Small, unmarked, heavy with intent, and walked to his building. A delivery guy buzzed me in, assuming I belonged. I took the stairs to Matthew's floor, found his door, and left the box outside. Inside, a printed photo of him and Emily at the cabin, her bird sketch taped to it, and a note in block letters, "Trees fall, birds get caught." No signature. Let him puzzle it out. I was back in my car when he returned, saw him pick it up, his face hardening as he read. He glanced around, then disappeared inside. I drove to Emily's office next, left a twin package in her car. Same photo, same sketch, same note. She'd find it at lunch. I wanted them both to feel the walls closing, to taste the unease I'd lived with. By noon, her burner phone buzzed. I'd cloned it to my laptop, a trick I'd learned online. "Did you get something weird?" She texted him. "Yeah," he replied. "What the hell's going on?" She didn't know. He didn't either. Perfect. That night, she was quiet, picking at her food, her eyes darting to me like I might sprout claws. I asked about her day, kept my tone light. "Fine," she muttered, then excused herself early. I heard her in the office, rifling through papers, probably looking for more sketches. She wouldn't find them. I'd locked them in my safe, a steel box she couldn't crack. But the seed was planted. She was jumpy, off balance. Matthew, too. I saw it in his next message. We need to cool off. Something's not right. She argued, pleaded, but he didn't budge. The tree was swaying. The bird was fluttering. My cage was ready. Wednesday, Emily cracked. She called in sick, stayed home, pacing the kitchen in her robe. I went to work, but circled back, parked down the street, and watched. At 10 a.m., Matthew's rental pulled up. He stormed inside, and I crept closer, peering through the blinds. They argued, her voice high, his low and sharp. Who knows? He snapped. Who sent that crap? She shook her head, tears streaking her face. I don't know. Maybe it's nothing. But she didn't believe it. Neither did he. I smiled, my breath fogging the glass. He left after 20 minutes and I followed. His sedan wove through traffic, erratic, paranoid. I stayed 3 cars back, patient. He stopped at a hardware store, bought bolt cutters and a padlock, preparing, maybe, for something he couldn't name. I let him go, returned home. Emily was in the shower, the water running long, like she could wash away the mess. I left another sketch on the counter. This one of the bird in a cage, wings clipped, the tree chopped down beside it. My handiwork, not hers. She found it that afternoon, gasped, and dropped her mug, coffee pooling on the tile. Where are these coming from? She whispered, to herself, to me, to no one. I walked in then, feigned surprise. You okay? I asked, mopping up the spill. She stared at me, her eyes searching, but said nothing. That night, she tried calling Matthew straight to voicemail. He'd cut her off. She sat on the couch, knees drawn up, and I watched her unravel, piece by piece. The bird was grounded. The tree was gone. And I wasn't done. The cage in the garage hummed louder now, its purpose sharpening in my mind. Thursday, I finalized it. Emily barely spoke, her face drawn, her hands trembling as she poured cereal for Lily. I kissed them both goodbye, drove to the edge of town, and rented a storage unit. Small, nondescript, cash only. I moved the cage there, set it up with the lockbox, the cable ties, the knife. It wasn't for her, not physically. I'd never touch her like that. It was a symbol, a stage for the endgame. I'd lure them both there, make them see it, make them feel the weight of what they'd done. I tracked Matthew next, found him at a bar, drinking alone. I slipped in, sat 2 stools down, and ordered a beer. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I listened as he muttered to the bartender about some psycho. His voice slurred. I left a note on his tab when he stumbled to the bathroom. Storage Unit 17. Midnight. Come alone. Or she pays. No bluff, he'd show. Back home. Emily was in bed early, lights off. I texted her from a burner of my own. Unit 17, midnight. He needs you. She'd go. She couldn't resist. Midnight loomed. I drove to the unit, parked in shadow, and waited. The cage gleamed under a single bulb, its bars a promise. They'd walk in together, see it, and know. My revenge wasn't blood. It was truth, cold and unyielding. A structure they couldn't unbuild. The bird would stay caged. The tree would rot. And I'd walk away free. The storage unit smelled of rust and damp concrete. The single bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across the cage. I stood in the corner, cloaked in darkness, my breath steady. The knife's weight a quiet comfort in my pocket. The clock ticked toward midnight, each second a hammer strike against the silence. I'd built this moment like a bridge, precise, unyielding, every girder locked into place. They'd come. They had to. The notes I'd left were hooks, baited with fear and need, pulling them here to face the structure of their ruin. At 11:58, headlights swept the lot. Emily's car. She stepped out, her coat pulled tight, her face pale under the sodium glow. She hesitated, glancing around, then walked to Unit 17, her steps uneven. I'd left the door ajar, a silent invitation. She pushed it open, froze when she saw the cage. Black, stark, its bars glinting like teeth. What the? She whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't see me yet. Then Matthew's sedan rolled in, gravel crunching, and he climbed out, his broad frame tense, his eyes darting. He'd brought the bolt cutters, clutched like a lifeline. He saw her car, strode to the unit, and stepped inside. Their eyes met, then locked on the cage. "You got the note too?" he asked, his voice low, edged with panic. She nodded, her hands wringing. "What is this? Who?" She stopped, spotting the lockbox on the cage's floor, taped to it. Another sketch, her bird, wings severed, the tree splintered, my handwriting scrawled across it. "You built this." Matthew swore, dropped the bolt cutters and grabbed her arm. "We need to go. Now." But the door slammed shut behind them. I'd rigged it with a remote latch, a trick from my engineering days. They spun, trapped, and I stepped into the light. "Tom!" Emily's voice cracked, her eyes wide, searching my face like I was a stranger. Matthew stiffened, his fists clenching, recognition dawning slow. "You!" he muttered, piecing it together. The photos, the notes, the breaks. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The cage spoke for me, its bars a testament to their betrayal, a mirror to the sketches she'd drawn. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket, hers, the one I'd taken, and tossed it into the cage. It clattered against the steel, the screen lighting up with their messages, glowing like a confession. "You've been busy," I said, my voice flat, cutting through the air. Birds and trees, a whole little world without me. Emily's knees buckled, and she gripped the cage for balance, her breath hitching. "How long have you known?" she whispered. "Long enough," I said. "The cabin, the sketches, every lie." I turned to Matthew. "And you? Thought you could take what's mine? Root yourself in my life?" He lunged, but I sidestepped, letting him crash into the cage. It rattled, steady as my resolve. I opened the lockbox with a key, pulled out the stack, photos, emails, every sketch she'd made. I spread them on the floor, a mosaic of their story. "Look at it," I said. "Your masterpiece." Emily sobbed, sinking to her knees, her hands reaching for the papers like she could erase them. Matthew glared, his jaw tight, but fear flickered in his eyes. "What do you want?" he growled. "To end this? To talk?" I smiled, cold and slow. "No, I want you to feel it. Every bar, every lie. I want you to live in this cage you built." I stepped back, locked the cage door with a padlock, and pocketed the key. They weren't staying inside, not physically, but the symbol was enough. "You're done," I said. "Both of you." Emily's cries echoed in the unit, raw and broken, as I walked to the door. "Tom, please, let's fix this." "For Lily," she begged, her hands clawing at the bars. Lily's name stung, but I didn't falter. "You broke her first," I said, my voice steel. "You don't get to use her now." Matthew kicked the cage, the clang reverberating, but it held. My work always did. "You're insane," he spat. "This won't change anything." I turned, met his gaze. "It already has." I opened the door, let the night air flood in, and tossed a second key onto the floor, just out of reach. "Figure it out," I said. "Or don't. I'm done carrying your weight." I left them there, the latch clicking shut behind me, their shouts fading as I walked to my car. The rain had stopped, the sky clear, stars sharp as blades. I drove home, the knife still in my pocket, and used but heavy with intent. The cage wasn't the end. It was the lever, the fulcrum to tip their world over. By morning, they'd be free physically, at least. The key was close enough to reach with effort, a test of their desperation. But the real cage was in their heads now, the bars I'd forged from truth and consequence. Emily would come home or she wouldn't. Matthew would slink back to his life or he'd run. Either way, I'd dismantled their story, uprooted the tree, clipped the bird's wings. My phone buzzed, Claire, checking on Lily. "She's fine," I texted back. "I'll pick her up soon." Lily was all I had left to anchor me. The rest could burn. Emily didn't come home that night. I didn't expect her to. I sat in the kitchen, coffee cold, the house too quiet without Lily's chatter. At 3 a.m., My cloned feed of her burner phone pinged. A message to Matthew. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. His reply, you're on your own. The tree had shed its bird, just as I'd planned. I deleted the feed, smashed the phone under my heel, and swept the pieces into the trash. Evidence gone. Bridges burned. Monday, I went to work drafting a new project. A suspension bridge, elegant and strong. My hands were steady, my mind clear. Claire dropped Lily off that evening, her eyes full of questions she didn't ask. Mommy's on a trip, I told Lily, and she nodded, trusting me like always. Emily's car was still at the storage unit when I checked. Empty. Abandoned. She'd left us, fled somewhere to lick her wounds. Matthew's sedan was gone from his condo lot. A for sale sign sprouted up a week later. He'd uprooted himself, too. I mailed the sketches to her firm, addressed to her boss, anonymously with a note. She's been busy. Let them see her art, her secrets. Let her scramble to explain. The cage stayed in the unit, a relic I'd dismantle later. Its purpose served. Friends called, asking where she was. I said she'd needed space, kept it vague. Lily asked once, then stopped, her silence louder than words. I'd shielded her from the wreckage, but I couldn't rebuild what Emily had torn down. Months passed. Spring bled into summer, the rain giving way to sun that warmed the bones of our house. Lily thrived, her laughter a balm, her drawings. Stick figures of us. Tacked to the fridge. No birds, no trees. Just us. Emily sent a letter once, postmarked Seattle, begging forgiveness. I burned it, unopened, the ashes scattered in the yard. Matthew's name faded from the news. His empire quietly sold off. They'd collapsed separately, their roots severed by my hand. I sold the house in fall, moved us to a new place. Smaller, brighter, a fresh blueprint. The cage was scrapped, its steel melted down, its story buried. I didn't need it anymore. Revenge wasn't the cage, the notes, the trap. It was letting them live with the ruin they'd sown, watching them choke on it while I walked away. Lily and I built something new, steady and true, a bridge to a future they couldn't touch. The bird was gone, the tree was felled, and I stood taller than both.